The laboratory at MIT smelled of solder and burnt coffee, a combination that had become familiar to 24-year-old Vivian Clark as her own perfume. It was October 1942, and the narrow research room on the third floor of Building 20, a hastily constructed wooden structure that the university had thrown up to house wartime research projects, had become her entire world. The windows were covered with blackout curtains even during the day, not because of air raid precautions as far from any potential enemy bombers, but because the work being done inside was classified at the highest levels. Oscilloscopes lined one wall, their green glowing screens casting an eerie light across workbenches cluttered with vacuum tubes, wire spools, and circuit diagrams covered in Vivian's precise handwriting. The clicking of telegraph keys and the hum of radio equipment created a constant background symphony that filled the spaces between thoughts. Vivian sat hunched over a workbench, a soldering iron in one hand and a pair of needle-nose pliers in the other, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun that had started to come loose hours ago. Her fingers, long and nimble, moved with the confidence of someone who had been taking apart radios since she was 12 years old, much to her father's alternating pride and exasperation. She was building something that didn't exist yet, something that everyone except her seemed to think was impossible, and she was running out of time to prove them wrong. The device taking shape under her hands looked like chaos to anyone else who might have wandered into the lab. It was a tangle of wires and circuits, vacuum tubes socketed into a breadboard in what seemed like random patterns, capacitors and resistors soldered in configurations that violated every standard radio engineering principle. But Vivian saw the order in it, saw the elegant solution to a problem that was costing Allied lives every single day across the Atlantic. The Germans had developed radio-controlled artillery that could adjust fire with devastating precision, guided by spotters using encrypted radio communications. Allied forces were being shredded by shells that seemed to know exactly where they were hiding, that adjusted trajectory mid-battle with uncanny accuracy. The brass at the War Department had asked MIT's radiation laboratory, the secretive division where America's best minds were developing radar and electronic warfare systems, to find a solution. They wanted jamming equipment, something to disrupt the German radio signals. Vivian had a different idea, one that her supervisor, Dr. Harold Pemberton, had called crazy, impractical, and a waste of valuable research time. She was going to hack their signals, not jam them. She was going to turn their own communications against them, feeding false targeting data back to their own system, making their precision artillery fire on wrong coordinates. It was audacious. It was unprecedented, and according to every expert she consulted, it was theoretically impossible with current technology. Vivian had never been particularly concerned with what experts said was impossible. She had grown up in a small town in upstate New York, the daughter of a telegraph operator and a mathematics teacher, and she had spent her childhood in the strange intersection between those two worlds. Her father had taught her Morse code before she could read cursive, sitting her on his lap at the telegraph office where he worked, letting her feel the rhythm of dots and dashes clicking through the key. Her mother had filled her head with numbers and equations, showing her the hidden patterns in everything from music to train schedules to the way leaves arrange themselves on trees. By the time she was 10, Vivian was building crystal radio sets from scratch, sitting in her bedroom late at night with headphones on, scanning across frequencies and listening to the world talk to itself. She heard police calls and ship-to-shore communications, broadcast radio and amateur operators, and she began to understand something fundamental that would shape everything that followed. Radio wasn't just about transmitting and receiving. It was about patterns, about the spaces between signals, about understanding the language that machines spoke to each other. She got her amateur radio license at 14, the youngest person in New York State to do so at the time, and by 16, she was winning regional competitions for speed and accuracy in Morse code transmission. Her parents had assumed she would become a teacher like her mother, maybe work as a telegraph operator like her father, live a quiet, respectable life in their small town. Then came MIT. Vivian had applied on a whim, not really believing she would be accepted, certainly not imagining she could afford it even if she was. But she had won a scholarship, one of only a handful given to women, and in the fall of 1936, she had arrived in Cambridge with a single suitcase and a head full of dreams. The next 4 years had been a revelation and a struggle in equal measure. She was one of only 6 women in the electrical engineering program, and she faced a constant barrage of skepticism and condescension from professors and male students who didn't think women belonged in technical fields. She had been excluded from study groups, had her ideas dismissed in class discussions, had been told more than once that she should consider switching to a more suitable major like home economics or library science. Vivian had responded by outperforming nearly everyone in her class, graduating in 1940 with the highest grades in her program and a job offer from Bell Laboratories. She had spent 2 years there, working on telephone switching systems and learning the intricacies of signal processing, before the war had pulled her back to MIT and into the classified world of the radiation laboratory. The work at the Rad Lab, as everyone called it, was unlike anything else in American science. The building was full of the country's most brilliant physicists and engineers, all working on technologies that would have seemed like science fiction just a few years earlier. Radar systems that could see through darkness and clouds, navigation equipment that could guide bombers across an ocean, electronic countermeasures to confuse enemy defenses. It was exhilarating and terrifying, working on projects that you knew would determine whether soldiers lived or died, whether battles were won or lost. If you ever felt like your ideas were dismissed because they seemed too unconventional, if you've ever been told your approach was crazy right before you prove it could work, then you understand a fire that drove Vivian Clark. Hit that subscribe button, because her story is just getting started, and what happens next will show you what determination and brilliance can accomplish when everyone else says it's impossible. Vivian had first proposed her signal hijacking idea in a meeting 3 months earlier, standing in front of a room full of senior researchers and military liaisons, drawing diagrams on a chalkboard while voices interrupted with objections and skeptical questions. The German radio-controlled artillery system worked on a relatively simple principle, she explained. Spotters in the field use radio transmitters to send targeting corrections back to the artillery units. The signals were encrypted, but they followed predictable patterns, transmitted on specific frequencies at specific intervals. If you could intercept those signals, decode them in real time, and then inject your own false signals back into the German network before their actual signals arrived, you could essentially hijack their targeting system. The artillery would receive what appeared to be legitimate corrections from their spotters, but they would actually be firing on coordinates you had fed them. Dr. Pemberton, her supervisor, had listened with increasing impatience before cutting her off. Miss Clark, he had said, his tone making it clear that he considered the miss a relevant qualifier. What you're describing would require signal processing speeds that are simply not achievable with current vacuum tube technology. You would need to intercept, decode, compute false coordinates, encode, and retransmit all within a window of perhaps 2 or 3 seconds. It can't be done. Vivian had stood there, chalk still in her hand, feeling the familiar heat of frustration rising in her chest. She had spent weeks working out the mathematics, testing components, building prototypes of the key circuits. She knew it could work, but Pemberton was already moving on, dismissing her idea as interesting in theory, but impractical for field deployment. The meeting had ended with a decision to pursue conventional jamming approaches instead, and Vivian had been reassigned to a different project, something boring involving radar range calculations. She had pretended to accept the decision, had nodded and said, "Yes, sir," and returned to her workstation. And then she had started working on her signal hijacking system anyway, on her own time, using surplus equipment and components she scrounged from other projects. It was professional suicide if she got caught, a waste of valuable war resources on an unauthorized project. But Vivian couldn't let it go. She knew she was right, knew that her approach could save lives, and she wasn't going to abandon it just because men with more authority and less imagination had told her it was impossible. The work consumed her nights and weekends. She would leave the lab at the official end of her shift, go home to her cramped apartment near Central Square, eat something that barely qualified as dinner, and then return to the lab after dark, letting herself in with a key she had copied without permission. The night security guards got used to seeing her, the strange young woman who worked at all hours, and they stopped questioning her presence. She built her prototype piece by piece, solving each technical challenge as it arose. The signal interception system was relatively straightforward, just a sensitive receiver tuned to the German frequencies. The real problems were speed and timing. Vacuum tubes, The electronic switches that made all radio and computing equipment work could only switch on and off so fast. The conventional wisdom said you couldn't process signals quickly enough for her hijacking scheme to work. Vivian's insight was that you didn't need to process every signal. You only needed to process the targeting corrections, which followed predictable patterns and occurred at predictable intervals. If you could anticipate when a signal was coming, you could pre-position your circuits to decode at the moment it arrived, shaving precious milliseconds off the processing time. She developed a system of parallel processing, multiple circuit paths running simultaneously, each one configured to handle a different type of signal. It was an elegant and brute force, the electronic equivalent of solving a problem by throwing more muscle at it instead of finding a clever shortcut, but it worked. By September, she had a prototype that could intercept a test signal, process it, and inject a false signal back into the circuit in under 2 seconds. It was crude and unreliable, working maybe 60% of the time, but it proved the concept. The next challenge was making it small and robust enough for field deployment, and that was where she was stuck on this October evening, staring at a circuit that kept overheating and burning out components. The clock on the wall showed 11:30 p.m. Vivian had been working for 16 hours straight, and her eyes felt like they had sand in them. She set down her soldering iron and rubbed her face, leaving a smudge of solder flux on her cheek. The problem was power consumption. Her parallel processing approach required more vacuum tubes than conventional radio, and all those tubes generated heat. In the confined space of the prototype chassis, that heat built up until something failed. She needed better cooling or fewer tubes, and she couldn't figure out how to achieve either without sacrificing performance. She stood up, stretching muscles that had gone stiff from sitting hunched over, and walked to the window. She pulled back the blackout curtain slightly and looked out at the Cambridge night. The city was dark under wartime restrictions, just a few streetlights and the glow of windows where other people were also working late. Somewhere across the Atlantic, men were dying because German artillery could target them with precision that Allied forces couldn't match. Every day she delayed was another day that advantage remained in enemy hands. The weight of that knowledge sat on her shoulders like a physical burden, making it hard to breathe sometimes. She let the curtain fall back and returned to her workbench, but instead of picking up the soldering iron, she grabbed a blank sheet of paper and started sketching. Sometimes the solution to an engineering problem wasn't more engineering. Sometimes it was stepping back and looking at the problem from a different angle. What if she was thinking about this wrong? What if instead of trying to make all the circuits work simultaneously, she staggered them, firing different tubes in sequence so they had time to cool between operations? It would add latency to the system, but maybe not enough to matter. She started working to mathematics, calculating signal delays and tube cooling times, and slowly a new architecture began to take shape in her mind. It was after 2 a.m. when she finally had a design that might work. She was too exhausted to start building it tonight, but she sketched out the complete circuit diagram, making notes about component specifications and timing sequences. She would need some parts she didn't have, would need to requisition them somehow without revealing what she was working on. That was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, she needed sleep. Vivian packed up her tools, covered the prototype with a sheet to hide it from casual observation, and headed home through the empty streets. The November cold bit her face, but she barely noticed. Her mind was still running through circuit designs, testing and discarding variations, optimizing signal paths. This was how she always worked. Even after she left the lab physically, her brain continued solving problems, working through equations in the background like a computer running overnight calculations. She fell asleep that night with vacuum tube symbols dancing behind her closed eyes, and she dreamed in circuit diagrams and frequency spectrums. The breakthrough came 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon that started like any other day. Vivian had been working on her revised prototype, whenever she could steal time, assembling the new staggered tube architecture in the late hours after her official work was done. She had finally gotten all the components she needed, had spent the previous weekend soldering and testing, and by Monday night, she had a working unit that was smaller and more reliable than her first attempt. On Tuesday, she decided to risk a full-scale test, using the lab signal generator to simulate German targeting transmissions. She set up the test equipment, powered up her device, and held her breath as she initiated the sequence. The oscilloscope showed the incoming test signal, a burst of encrypted data on the German frequency. Her interceptor caught it. The processing circuits lit up in sequence, and 3 seconds later her transmitter fired, injecting a false signal back into the system. 3 seconds. It was still too slow, a full second longer than her target, but it had worked. Every component had functioned correctly. No tubes had burned out, and the false signal had been correctly formatted and transmitted. She could optimize from here, could probably shave off another second through better component selection and circuit tuning. She was so focused on studying the oscilloscope traces that she didn't hear the door open behind her, didn't realize anyone else had entered the lab until Dr. Pemberton's voice cut through her concentration. "Miss Clark, what exactly are you working on?" Vivian spun around, her heart jumping into her throat. Pemberton stood in the doorway, briefcase in one hand, his expression somewhere between confused and angry. Behind him was Colonel Matthews from the Army Signal Corps, one of the military liaisons who oversaw the Rad Lab's projects. This was it. She was caught, working on an unauthorized project using lab resources, probably about to be fired or maybe even charged with misuse of military equipment. For a moment, she considered lying, making up some cover story about testing equipment for her assigned project. But she had never been good at lying, and besides, the evidence was right there on the workbench. Her signal hijacking device connected to test equipment in a configuration that made its purpose obvious to anyone who knew radio engineering. She decided to go down fighting. "I'm working on a solution to the German artillery problem, sir," she said, meeting Pemberton's eyes. "The signal hijacking system I proposed in August. I've built a working prototype." Pemberton's expression darkened. "You were explicitly told that project was not feasible. This is a serious breach of protocol. Miss Clark, you've wasted resources and time on it. Works." Vivian interrupted, which was probably another terminable offense, interrupting your supervisor, but she was already in trouble, so she might as well be hanged for a sheep as a lamb. "I just completed a successful test. Full intercept, decode, and false signal injection in 3 seconds. I can get it down to 2 seconds with optimization." The room went very quiet. Colonel Matthews stepped forward, his eyes moving from Vivian to the equipment on the bench to the oscilloscope traces still glowing on the screen. "Show me," he said. It wasn't a request. Vivian's hand shook slightly as she reset the test equipment, but her voice was steady as she explained what she was about to demonstrate. She walked them through the system architecture, the signal flow, the processing sequence. Pemberton's expression had shifted from angry to intrigued, his engineer's curiosity overcoming his irritation at her insubordination. She ran the test again, and this time both men watched the oscilloscope, seeing the incoming test signal, the processing circuits activating in sequence, and the false signal transmitting back. Matthews looked at his watch. 2.8 seconds, he said. "How fast can you make it?" 2 seconds, possibly less, Vivian said, with better components and more testing. "How reliable is it?" "Right now, maybe 70% success rate, but that's with a prototype built from scrap components. With proper engineering and quality parts, I could get to 95% or better." Matthews turned to Pemberton. "Why was I not informed that you had a working solution to this problem?" Pemberton had the grace to look embarrassed. "Colonel, I wasn't aware that Miss Clark had continued working on this project after I told her it wasn't feasible. This was done without authorization." "I don't care about authorization," Matthews cut him off. "I care about results. This device could save lives. How soon can you have a field-ready version?" The question was directed at Vivian, and she felt a surge of indication, so strong it was almost dizzying. 6 weeks, sir," she said. "Maybe less if I can get priority access to components and machine shop time." "You have it," Matthews said immediately. "Whatever you need. This is now a priority project. Dr. Pemberton, I want Miss Clark relieved of all other duties effective immediately. She reports directly to me until this device is operational. Is that clear?" Pemberton nodded, and Vivian could see him struggling with multiple emotions, professional embarrassment at having dismissed a solution that was now being prioritized over his objections, but also a kind of grudging respect for what she had accomplished. "Miss Clark," Matthews continued, "you'll need a team. Can't have one person as the sole point of knowledge on a critical weapon system. Pick whoever you need from the lab staff." Vivian's mind was already racing ahead, thinking about who she would need, what skills would be required to turn her prototype into a production-ready system. "Yes, sir," she said. "I'll have a team proposal and project plan ready by tomorrow morning." Matthews nodded, then paused, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "One more thing, Miss Clark. If this works in the field, if this device does what you claim it can do, you'll have saved a lot of lives. But you'll also have done it by ignoring direct orders and working on unauthorized projects. That puts me in an awkward position from a command perspective. Do you understand?" Vivian understood exactly what he was saying. If her device succeeded, she would be a hero who had won through determination and brilliance. If it failed, she would be the insubordinate engineer who had wasted resources on a pet project. There was no middle ground, no safe position where she could claim credit for the success while avoiding blame for the risk. She nodded. "I understand, sir. It will work. I'll make it work." "See that you do," Matthews said, and then he was gone, leaving Vivian alone with Pemberton in the lab full of equipment. Pemberton looked at her for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet. "That was either very brave or very foolish, Miss Clark. I'm not sure which." "Maybe both, sir," Vivian said. "Well," Pemberton said, and the hint of a smile tugged at his mouth, "at least you're not boring. Get me that project plan tomorrow. And Miss Clark, good work. Truly." It was the first genuine compliment he had ever given her, and it meant more than she wanted to admit. After he left, Vivian sat down at her workbench and let herself shake for a few minutes, the adrenaline finally catching up with her. She had gambled everything on an idea everyone else thought was crazy, and somehow, impossibly, she had won. Now came the hard part, actually making it work in the field. The next 6 weeks were the most intense of Vivian's life. She assembled a team of 8 engineers and technicians, picking people she knew were brilliant and flexible enough to work on a project that required constant innovation and problem-solving. She commandeered a larger lab space, requisitioned equipment and components with Colonel Matthews's authorization, and established a work schedule that had the team operating in rotating shifts around the clock. The device, which someone had nicknamed the Ghost Transmitter, because it haunted the German radio networks with false signals, evolved rapidly from prototype to production-ready system. Vivian drove herself and her team relentlessly, but she also learned to delegate, to trust other people's expertise, to accept that she couldn't solve every problem herself. The staggered tube architecture worked even better than she had hoped, and by the end of the second week, they had gotten the processing time down to 1.8 seconds with a reliability rate of 87%. The team celebrated that milestone with a bottle of whiskey someone had been saving, passing around in paper cups, and toasting the Ghost Transmitter and its creator. Vivian drank very little. She had never been much of a drinker, but she felt drunk anyway on success and exhaustion, and the strained camaraderie that develops among people working together toward a common goal. They still had weeks of work ahead, testing and refinement and documentation, but in that moment she let herself feel what she had barely allowed herself to believe. This was going to work. They were going to put her crazy idea into the field, and it was going to save lives. The testing phase revealed problems that Vivian hadn't anticipated. The Ghost Transmitter worked beautifully in the controlled environment of the lab, but when they started testing it with actual radio interference and signal degradation, the reliability dropped precipitously. Signals that were clear and strong in the lab became muddy and fragmented when transmitted over distance, and the device struggled to distinguish legitimate German signals from random noise. Vivian spent a week working on improved filtering algorithms, essentially teaching the device to recognize the signature patterns of German transmissions even when they were partially obscured by interference. It was painstaking work, adjusting and testing and adjusting again, but gradually the reliability climbed back up. By the 4th week, they were hitting 92% success rate even with simulated field conditions, and Vivian felt confident enough to tell Colonel Matthews they were ready for live testing. The Army arranged for a field test at a range in New Jersey, setting up a scenario that mimicked German artillery operations as closely as possible. Vivian and her team packed up the ghost transmitter, which now lived in a reinforced metal case about the size of a steamer trunk, and drove down in a military truck, arriving at the range on a cold December morning. The test was simple in concept, but demanding in execution. A team of Army signalmen would operate a radio-controlled artillery simulator, sending targeting corrections to gun crews using equipment and procedures captured from the Germans. Vivian's team would attempt to intercept those signals and feed false coordinates back to the gun crews. Success meant the artillery would fire on the wrong coordinates. Failure meant the system didn't work, and they were back to the drawing board. The question was directed at Vivian, and she felt a surge of vindication, so strong it was almost dizzying. 6 weeks, sir, she said. Maybe less if I can get priority access to components and machine shop time. You have it, Matthews said immediately. Whatever you need. This is now a priority project. Dr. Pemberton, I want Miss Clark relieved of all other duties effective immediately. She reports directly to me until this device is operational. Is that clear? Pemberton nodded, and Vivian could see him struggling with multiple emotions, professional embarrassment at having dismissed a solution that was now being prioritized over his objections, but also a kind of grudging respect for what she had accomplished. Miss Clark, Matthews continued, you'll need a team. Can't have one person as the sole point of knowledge on a critical weapon system. Pick whoever you need from the lab staff. Vivian's mind was already racing ahead, thinking about who she would need, what skills would be required to turn her prototype into a production-ready system. Yes, sir, she said. I'll have a team proposal and project plan ready by tomorrow morning. Matthews nodded, then paused, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. One more thing, Miss Clark. If this works in the field, if this device does what you claim it can do, you'll have saved a lot of lives. But you'll also have done it by ignoring direct orders and working on unauthorized projects. That puts me in an awkward position from a command perspective. Do you understand? Vivian understood exactly what he was saying. If her device succeeded, she would be a hero who had won through determination and brilliance. If it failed, she would be the insubordinate engineer who had wasted resources on a pet project. There was no middle ground, no safe position where she could claim credit for success while avoiding blame for the risk. She nodded. I understand, sir. It will work. I'll make it work. See that you do, Matthews said, and then he was gone, leaving Vivian alone with Pemberton in a lab full of equipment. Pemberton looked at her for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet. That was either very brave or very foolish, Miss Clark. I'm not sure which. Maybe both, sir, Vivian said. Well, Pemberton said, and the hint of a smile tugged at his mouth, at least you're not boring. Get me that project plan tomorrow. And Miss Clark, good work. Truly. It was the first genuine compliment he had ever given her, and it meant more than she wanted to admit. After he left, Vivian sat down at her workbench and let herself shake for a few minutes, the adrenaline finally catching up with her. She had gambled everything on an idea everyone else thought was crazy, and somehow, impossibly, she had won. Now came the hard part, actually making it work in the field. The next 6 weeks were the most intense of Vivian's life. She assembled a team of 8 engineers and technicians, picking people she knew were brilliant and flexible enough to work on a project that required constant innovation and problem-solving. She commandeered a larger lab space, requisitioned equipment and components with Colonel Matthews's authorization, and established a work schedule that had the team operating in rotating shifts around the clock. The device, which someone had nicknamed the Ghost Transmitter because it haunted the German radio networks with false signals, evolved rapidly from prototype to production-ready system. Vivian drove herself and her team relentlessly, but she also learned to delegate, to trust other people's expertise, to accept that she couldn't solve every problem herself. The staggered tube architecture worked even better than she had hoped, and by the end of the second week, they had gotten the processing time down to 1.8 seconds with a reliability rate of 87%. The team celebrated that milestone with a bottle of whiskey someone had been saving, passing around in paper cups, and toasting the Ghost Transmitter and its creator. Vivian drank very little. She had never been much of a drinker, But she fell drunk anyway on success and exhaustion, and the strange camaraderie that develops among people working together toward a common goal. They still had weeks of work ahead, testing and refinement and documentation. But in that moment, she let herself feel what she had barely allowed herself to believe. This was going to work. They were going to put her crazy idea into the field, and it was going to save lives. The testing phase revealed problems that Vivian hadn't anticipated. The ghost transmitter worked beautifully in a controlled environment of the lab, but when they started testing it with actual radio interference and signal degradation, the reliability dropped precipitously. Signals that were clear and strong in the lab became muddy and fragmented when transmitted over distance, and the device struggled to distinguish legitimate German signals from random noise. Vivian spent a week working on improved filtering algorithms, essentially teaching the device to recognize the signature patterns of German transmissions even when they were partially obscured by interference. It was painstaking work, adjusting and testing and adjusting again, but gradually the reliability climbed back up. By the fourth week, they were hitting 92% success rate, even with simulated field conditions, and Vivian felt confident enough to tell Colonel Matthews they were ready for live testing. The Army arranged for a field test at a range in New Jersey, setting up a scenario that mimicked German artillery operations as closely as possible. Vivian and her team packed up the ghost transmitter, which now lived in a reinforced metal case about the size of a steamer trunk, and drove down in a military truck, arriving at the range on a cold December morning. The test was simple in concept, but demanding in execution. A team of Army signalmen would operate a radio-controlled artillery simulator, sending targeting corrections to gun crews using equipment and procedures captured from the Germans. Vivian's team would attempt to intercept those signals and feed false coordinates back to the gun crews. Success meant the artillery would fire on the wrong coordinates. Failure meant the system didn't work, and they were back to the drawing board. The intelligence estimates, when she finally got clearance to see them, suggested that the ghost transmitter had degraded German artillery effectiveness by 30 to 40% in areas where it was deployed and had contributed to the success of multiple Allied operations. 30 to 40%. It was a statistic cold and abstract, but Vivian tried to imagine what it meant in human terms. How many soldiers had survived because shells fell wide of their positions? How many towns had been spared destruction because artillery couldn't be accurately targeted? The numbers were ultimately unknowable, but they were real. Her crazy idea, the project everyone had said was impossible, had changed the course of the war in ways both measurable and immeasurable. After the war ended, Vivian stayed with the government for another year, helping to document and declassify the various electronic warfare projects she had overseen, writing reports that would inform military communication strategy for decades to come. In 1946, she resigned from her Pentagon position and accepted a faculty appointment at MIT, returning to the institution where she had started her career, but now as Professor Clark, one of the first women to hold a faculty position in the electrical engineering department. She taught and conducted research, training a new generation of engineers in radio and signal processing, though she could never tell her students about the ghost transmitter or the other classified work she had done. That would remain secret for another 30 years, until documents started to be declassified in the 1970s, and military historians began to piece together the story of electronic warfare in World War II. The recognition, when it finally came, was both gratifying and strange. In 1975, at age 57, Vivian was awarded the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service, one of the highest civilian honors the military could bestow. The ceremony was held in the same Pentagon building where she had worked 3 decades earlier, and she stood on a stage while a general she didn't know read a citation, describing her contributions to the war effort in language that managed to be both laudatory and vague about the technical details. After the ceremony, veterans approached her, men who had served in Signal Corps units, who had operated ghost transmitters in the field, who wanted to thank the woman who had built the device that had kept them alive. One man, a retired colonel who had to be in his 60s, took her hand with tears in his eyes. "My unit was pinned down by German artillery in France," he said. "We were taking accurate fire. They had us ranged perfectly. We thought we were done. Then we got one of your boxes, and suddenly the shells started falling wide. We walked away from that position, when by all rights we should have been killed. You saved my life, ma'am. You saved all our lives." Vivian didn't know what to say to that. She had never thought of her work in such personal terms, had always conceptualized it as a technical problem to be solved rather than a life-saving intervention. But standing there, shaking hands with a man who would have died without the device she had built, she felt the full weight of what she had accomplished finally settle on her shoulders. The years that followed were quieter, but no less productive. Vivian continued teaching and research, branching out into early computer science and digital signal processing as electronics technology evolved beyond the vacuum tubes she had worked with during the war. She mentored countless students, particularly women who faced the same skepticism and barriers she had encountered, and she became known as a fierce advocate for opening technical fields to anyone with the talent and determination to succeed regardless of gender. She published papers on signal theory and electronic warfare that became foundational texts in the field, though even decades later some of her work remained classified. She consulted for the military and various defense contractors, lending her expertise to the development of new communications and electronic warfare systems. She never married, dedicating her life entirely to her work and her students, and she never expressed any regret about that choice. When asked about it in interviews, she would say simply that she had been too busy changing the world to worry about conventional expectations of what a woman's life should look like. Vivian Clark died in 1998 at the age of 80, still sharp and engaged even as her body failed, still working on a paper about digital signal processing that would be published posthumously. Her obituary in the New York Times finally told the story of the ghost transmitter in full, describing how a young engineer's crazy idea had disrupted German artillery and saved countless Allied lives. The article quoted military historians who called her one of the unsung heroes of World War II, a woman whose technical genius had contributed as much to victory as many more famous figures. The funeral was held at MIT, in the same chapel where she had attended so many memorial services for colleagues and students over the years. The attendance was remarkable. Hundreds of people whose lives she had touched in ways direct and indirect. Former students who had gone on to distinguished careers. Veterans who had used her devices. Engineers who had read her papers and been inspired by her work. Colleagues who fought alongside her in the long struggle to open technical fields to women. The eulogies painted a picture of a woman who had been brilliant, demanding, uncompromising, and deeply committed to using her gifts to make the world better. One speaker, a former student who had become a prominent computer scientist, said something that would have made Vivian smile. "Professor Clark taught us that crazy ideas aren't crazy if they work. She taught us that the experts can be wrong. She taught us that the answer to that's impossible is, watch me. And most importantly, she taught us that one person with a good idea and the determination to pursue it can change the course of history. We stand here today because Vivian Clark refused to accept impossible as an answer." The ghost transmitter itself became a museum piece, examples preserved in military museums and the Smithsonian Institution's collection of significant wartime technology. To modernize, the device looks primitive and crude, a box full of vacuum tubes and hand-wired circuits that could be replaced by a single computer chip today. But in 1942, it represented the cutting edge of electronic warfare, a revolutionary approach to disrupting enemy communications that influenced military strategy for decades. The principles Vivian developed, signal interception and deception, real-time processing, and electronic countermeasures, became foundational concepts in modern warfare. Every time a military force jams enemy communications, every time signals are intercepted and analyzed, every time electronic systems are used to deceive and disrupt adversaries, they are using techniques that trace their lineage back to Vivian Clark's work in that MIT laboratory. Her legacy extends beyond the specific device she built. She was part of a generation of women who entered technical fields during World War II, filling positions left vacant by men serving in the military, and who proved beyond any doubt that women could excel in science and engineering. Many of these women were pushed back out of technical careers after the war ended, their contributions forgotten or minimized as men returned and reclaimed their positions. But some, like Vivian, stayed and fought and opened doors that would never fully close again. Every woman working in engineering or computer science today walks through doors that women like Vivian Clark forced open through their talent and determination. The story of how the ghost transmitter came to be is also a reminder that innovation often comes from unexpected places, from people willing to challenge authority and conventional wisdom. If Vivian had accepted Dr. Pemberton's initial dismissal of her idea, if she had believed the experts who said it was impossible, the device would never have been built. How many other good ideas have been lost because their creators didn't have Vivian's determination or weren't willing to risk their careers on an unauthorized project? The question is unanswerable but worth asking. Progress requires not just brilliant ideas, but also the courage to pursue those ideas in the face of skepticism and opposition. Vivian understood that, lived it, and in doing so, she changed not just the course of a war, but the trajectory of an entire field of technology. In recent years, there has been increased recognition of the contributions women made to World War II beyond the traditional narratives of Rosie the Riveter and military nurses. Historians have uncovered stories of women who were codebreakers, resistance fighters, pilots, spies, and engineers. Vivian Clark's story fits into this broader recognition that women were not merely supporting players in the war effort, but essential contributors who developed new technologies, broke enemy codes, and took risks that changed the course of history. Her story is being taught in engineering schools now, used as an example of innovation and determination, and her name is becoming known to a new generation of students who can look to her as a role model and inspiration. If you made it this far in Vivian's story, if her determination and brilliance have inspired you, then you understand why these stories matter. These aren't just historical footnotes. They're reminders that the people who change the world are often the ones who refuse to accept impossible as an answer, who work in secret on crazy ideas that everyone else dismissed, who risk everything on their conviction that they're right. Take a moment to like this video if Vivian's story moved you. Leave a comment saying frequency of courage to let me know you were here until the end. And if you want to hear more stories of women who change history through science and innovation, subscribe to this channel. There are so many more stories waiting to be told, so many more voices that deserve to be heard. Vivian Clark turned the tide against Nazi artillery with a radio hack everyone said was impossible. Imagine what you could do if you stopped listening to the people telling you your ideas are crazy. Another incredible story of wartime innovation and courage is waiting in the next video, just one click away. Thank you for being here, for caring about these stories, for keeping the memory of people like Vivian alive. The frequency of courage carries across time, and it's up to us to keep transmitting it.